Hello, welcome to the Doctors Who Read Stuff. My name is Chris, and tonight we'll be discussing Enterprise, the First Adventure by Vonda N. McIntyre. Okay, so I think everybody's aware of Kirk's first adventure on the Enterprise because of the J.J. Abrams reboot. Now, we can all agree that it's visually spectacular. I personally think the way they explained the parallel timeline and the recasting and the differences was genius, but that's beside the point. What we're doing today is we're looking at the first adventure of Captain Kirk in the Prime timeline, which I don't think we've really covered at all. So this book comes out in the neighborhood of... It was just here. I promise I'm not losing my brain. Well, I might be losing my brain, but that's beside the point. This is from 1986. September of 1986. So, my goodness, that's what, 34 years ago? If my math is correct, which it usually is not. Now, there are things about this book that are phenomenal. I love the fact that there's no epic disaster or threat that forces a young Captain Kirk to assume command before he's meant to. That's not what's happening here. He's gotten to where he is by being human, right? He and Gary Mitchell, who you will remember, Silver Eyes, right? Yeah. Were injured in their previous assignment. They managed to save the day, which caused Kirk to get his promotion. Now, in this book, he wanted Gary Mitchell to be his first officer, but instead he's stuck with this stoic Vulcan. Now, and one of the fleet admirals makes the comment that, you know what, I wouldn't have granted Gary Mitchell the position of first officer because you and he are too much alike. A first officer should be complementary to the captain. They should not be identical in personality, impulse control, blatant disregard for the rules, all of those things, right? So I really like how at the beginning the dynamic of the crew coming together is not great. Sulu is transferred at the last minute thinking he was going to be on a different assignment. He doesn't want to be on the Enterprise. He wants to get off. McCoy knew Kirk from previous assignments, but he shows up at the last minute because he was on shore leave out of communicator and transport range. Spock thinks Kirk is young, impetuous, brash, which, let's be honest, is not far from the truth. And Scotty just has like flat out disdain. I mean, it actually comes to the point at some point in the book where Kirk says, look, one of us has to leave and it's not going to be me. So there's a lot of tension. There's a lot of people rubbing each other the wrong way. But I think that's what really makes this book work. The first half to 3/4 of this book, and it's not a small book by any means. I mean, they bill this as, I think, the giant novel, one of the first giant novels that Star Trek's produced. And it comes in at 371 pages. It does read a lot longer because most of these, I think, are in the neighborhood of 200 pages from this time frame. So there's a lot in here, and the first half is really just Kirk getting used to the crew. We do get to see some Christopher Pike as well, and he's that stoic, reserved figure that you see from The Cage and then Menagerie. And Uhura has served with Spock and Pike before, and she's not sure what to make of Kirk either. But you have these grounding characters that kind of tie the two legacies of the captains together almost. So it's interesting. Now, it would not be a Star Trek novel, especially one of the serial novels from the 80s, if you didn't have an adversary. And the adversary in this book comes in the form of a Klingon woman who manages to come into possession of the Empire's secret new fighter and decides to go cause some problems. She is probably the weakest part of this book, if we are honest. And that being said, you usually come across a weak villain or a weak antagonist, and you're like, well, that kind of ruins the story, doesn't it? In this case, no, it doesn't. The intriguing parts for me are really around how this crew coalesces, comes together, gets past their differences, and learns to appreciate all the things that they can offer. So it's really the adversary is really like a side plot to this entire thing. Now, the Enterprise is on its way out to one of the star bases kind of bordering the Klingon Empire when this enormous thing kind of appears like right between Federation and Klingon space. Now this is, they call it the Phalanx, I believe, and it's like this space where like they're not really sure what the borders are, so they might be in Klingon space, they might be in Federation space, it just depends on who's making the accusation. But it's basically this enormous world ship that Spock believes to be from another galaxy, and it's a first contact. And the Enterprise arrives, this Klingon lady and her fancy new ship arrive, and that's kind of where you get some tension outside of the ship's relationships, like the crew's relationships on the ship. So there were a couple of things that I did notice that kind of, I don't think they bothered me so much as I was like kind of like, whoa, wait a second. And that was the fact that the Enterprise in this book is not referred to as a Constitution class vessel. She's referred to as a Constellation class vessel. I swear I've not had a thing to drink today. And then they more than once make reference to the Federation of Planets, not the United Federation of Planets, just the Federation of Planets. So, I mean, those are really my only drawback, or my only negative complaints about this book. I've read a lot of books by Vonda McIntyre. She was very good at this. The books are enjoyable. The characters are well thought out. There's dialogue. There's growth. And here's the important thing I look for, or that I notice when I'm reading a Star Trek book. You know, you can read a line of Spock's, and you could say, oh, well, holy smokes. That is not something the character of Spock would say. Like, just, you can, if you watch enough Star Trek and you read enough Star Trek, you can look at a sentence and be like, no, that is not what Spock would say. That is not what Riker would say. That's not how Picard would say that. And Vonda McIntyre seems to get it right. I don't recall an instance in this book where I was like, oh, that piece of dialogue seems out of character for Captain Kirk or Lieutenant Uhura or whoever it is. So, yeah, I mean, this book, I read this initially probably 25 years ago. 25, 27 years ago, so it would have been in the 90s, and my aunt actually gave me a huge box full of just serial Star Trek novels from the 80s because she knew I was a fan. And from the point where I was probably in 6th or 7th grade, this is what I read. Like, I didn't read the Hardy Boys or Boxcar Children or stuff like that. I read Star Trek books, which shaped me to be the geek you know and love today. So, to come back after a 20 plus year hiatus, and to read this again was a joy. Especially having some of the context of what we saw with J.J. Abrams' 2009 Star Trek, which, while enjoyable, was implausible in that all of a sudden this recruit out of Starfleet Command becomes captain through a series of bizarre events that would never transpire. I still love that movie, but there are some legitimate complaints that I have. So, anyway, we can save that for another time. If you see this book, this is the part where I tell you whether or not you should buy it and read it or not, and the answer is yes, you should. It's fun. It's believable within the context of the Star Trek universe that we grew up watching. And I don't know, it's just to come back and revisit Kirk's first mission in a scenario where he comes aboard the ship and he has to work to earn the trust and the respect of the crew. It's really good. This is good reading. So, yes, buy this book. Read this book. And if you like what you have just listened to and seen, you can tap on, I think it's down there, the like button. Please sound off in the comments if you have read this or you have questions on it. And these are going to continue every week, so please click the subscribe button. We look forward to seeing you next time, and we hope you'll check out some of our other content as well. And until then, as our co-host Brian would say, because this did start out as a Doctor Who podcast, Allons-y.